Perfectly fried eggs, fluffy pastries, heck, just spread it on toast. Forget everything you think you know about lard. Here's the skinny on this once popular fat product. Lard is simply rendered pork fat, but pigs have lots of fat, and fat from different areas will yield lard with slightly different qualities. In general, lard is made from one of two kinds of fat, back fat and fat from around the pig's kidneys, which is known as leaf fat. Lard made from the leaf fat has a milder, more neutral flavor and a paler color, so it's preferred by bakers for sweets such as pies and pastries.
They're just honey-sweetened batter. Go on. Deep-fried and hog lard.
Lard, you say?
On the other hand, back fat yields lard with a more distinctly porky taste. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact can be a plus, depending on how you plan to use your lard. Leaf lard is also much more expensive than back fat, since there's a lot less of it. So if you've made or purchased a batch of pure leaf lard, it is wise to save it for preparations that showcase its clean flavor and pale color. To turn raw pig fat into lard, you need to melt the fat and separate out any impurities. The process is called rendering. There are two basic ways of rendering fat: dry rendering and wet rendering. Both can be used to make lard. Dry rendering, as its name implies, involves melting the fat directly in a container with no added liquid. Wet rendering, on the other hand, involves melting the fat by steaming it or cooking it in water. In industrial settings, the melted fat generated by wet rendering is skimmed off the top of the water or separated from it with a centrifuge. Home cooks making lard by wet rendering can simply refrigerate the melted fat until it hardens, then drain off any remaining water that hasn't evaporated during rendering. Both methods have their advantages and disadvantages. Dry rendering introduces a slightly higher chance of burning the fat before it's fully rendered, since it's directly exposed to heat. Wet rendering requires the additional step of separating the residual liquid after the fat has melted, and each method generates a different flavor profile. Wet rendering creates lard with a lighter color, milder flavor, and higher smoking point, while dry rendering creates lard with a toastier color and lower smoking point. Fans of homemade lard can go on forever about how much better it is than that random box stuff from the supermarket. Besides generally being fresher, homemade lard is free from the preservatives and stabilizers commonly added to industrial lard. Plus, if you choose to make your lard with fat from a pasture-raised pig, it'll more likely be free from any potentially harmful chemicals found in conventionally raised pork. In addition, lard proponents will be quick to tell you that unlike solid vegetable shortening, lard is free from one particularly unhealthy type of fat.
It's called trans fat, an industrially produced oil common in the baked, packaged and fried foods we eat every day.
But while homemade lard and the small batch artisanal lard you can sometimes find at butcher shops and farmers markets are indeed free from trans fat, that's not the case for all industrial lard. Some brands of shelf-stable lard are produced using hydrogenation, resulting in the presence of trans fats. So you'd be getting a double whammy of both saturated animal fats and trans fats. If you do want to try making lard at home, keep watching. To make good quality lard, you need to start with good quality pork fat. Most importantly, you should ensure the fat you use is fresh, since the fresher the fat, the fresher and cleaner your lard will taste. So don't just go dumpster diving for the stuff.
Richest, creamiest fat in the world. Fat of the land.
Ideally, you should use fat from an animal slaughtered within the past 5 days. Fat any older than that will render into lard with inferior keeping qualities and a lower smoke point. Once you have your fat, remove as much of the rind as possible, as well as any bits of lean meat that may be attached, since they can darken the finished lard. Fat for lard making can be purchased online or from a butcher. Most butchers will have pork fat on hand, even if it's not on display. But if you want to get fancy, some serious cooks recommend seeking out farms that pasture-raise their pigs to obtain the freshest, highest quality fat. Animals store residue from food additives and chemicals used in conventional commercial farming in their fat. So using fat from animals that have been raised without these chemicals ensures you won't be consuming them either. Well-made lard can range in flavor from completely neutral to faintly porky, and both types are acceptable. Some fans prefer their lard with a more distinctive flavor.
It's basically lard balls, and it is utterly delicious.
However, gamey, brown lard is not what anyone wants. Ideally, your lard should turn out pure white when cooled and hardened. First, remove any rind or bits of lean meat from the fat you plan to use before rendering it. Cut the fat into small pieces. This will not only speed up the rendering process, but also ensure any impurities, such as bits of skin, render out fully. Next, be sure to render your fat over low heat. Higher heat can brown or burn the fat, which again is not what you want. Also, stir the fat regularly as it renders to prevent it from sticking to the sides or bottom of your cooking baking pan, which can also result in browning. Finally, don't overdo it. Take your lard off the heat as soon as it's fully rendered. You'll know it's ready when the cracklings, or crispy bits of fatty residue, turn amber, and steam stops rising from the hot fat, meaning all the water has been cooked out. Lard is valued by cooks around the world for its great frying qualities and the tender, flaky quality it lends to baked goods. It's also valued for its relatively neutral flavor. Well-rendered lard will be mildly flavored enough not to overwhelm the other ingredients in a dish. In some cases, it's even better than butter. Some lard fans love it enough to eat it as a snack.
It's delicious.
I'll hear you.
If you count yourself among these fans, you might want to try a relatively little-known but super rich Italian specialty, lardo, or cured flavored pig fat. Traditionally, it's treated like a cold cut and served in ultra-thin, melt-in-your-mouth slices on toasted bread or used in pastas. Other cultures around the world have similar preparations. While it sounds fancy and exotic, in reality it requires far less hands-on work than regular rendered lard. All you need to do is procure a good quality piece of pork back fat, rub it with salt, curing salt, and flavorings that may include rosemary, bay leaves, and pepper, seal in an airtight plastic bag, and set it in the refrigerator for at least 3 months to cure. Cut into thin slices to serve. It will keep in the fridge for about 4 months. While making lard is perfectly safe for those who know their way around the kitchen, it does have its risks. Even though lard is rendered at low heat, melted fat can seriously burn your skin, and the risk of a grease fire is real, especially if you get distracted and walk away from the stove. So keep a close eye on your lard and don't let it overheat. If your lard does catch fire, do not pour water on it. The burning lard will just float on top of the water and might spill out of your pot, spreading the fire. To put out the fire, use a fire extinguisher if you have one, or quickly cover the pot with a lid and remove it from the heat to smother the flames. Also remember, your finished lard will be hotter than it looks. It's deceptive because it won't bubble like boiling water. So if you plan to store your lard in plastic containers, ensure the lard is below 212 degrees Fahrenheit before filling the containers to keep them from melting. And if you're using glass containers, use only those designed for canning and pre-warm them so they won't shatter when filled with hot lard. As you render your lard, you'll notice the cut-up pieces of pork fat gradually shrinking as they start to liquefy. As the rendering progresses, some of the pieces stubbornly refuse to melt any further. Instead, they'll stay intact and at some point will start to fry and brown in the liquefied fat. Don't be alarmed by this. These fatty bits or cracklings are not only a totally normal byproduct of lard rendering, but to many are the best part of the long process because they're a rich, crunchy, and utterly delicious little treat. If you enjoy pork rinds, cracklings will be right up your alley.
Pork rind? Pork rind.
You can always just salt them and snack on them, but creative cooks have found numerous other ways to use them. They are a great substitute for bacon bits, for instance, and make a tasty topper for soups or salads. They can also be tossed with stir-fried or sautéed veggies for an extra burst of crunch and flavor. There's no getting around it. Making lard is a long, hot process that requires patience and a vigilant watch. If you want good quality lard, you can't rush this process, but you can make it a little easier on yourself and less dangerous by making your lard in a slow cooker. Rendering your lard this way with even gentler heat than a stovetop will take longer, but because you don't need to stand by the stove and stir the mixture as often, you'll have a lot less work to do.
The Crock Watcher. While it's doing your cooking,
You could be doing other things.
The process is pretty much like rendering lard on a stovetop. Put your trimmed, finely chopped pork fat in the cooker with some water and cook on low without a lid for several hours. Stir about once an hour. Be aware though that the cracklings left behind after slow cooker rendering will be soft rather than crisp, but you can always crisp them up later in a frying pan. One of the benchmarks of good quality lard is a clean white appearance with no suspicious little bits suspended in it. This is not only for aesthetic purposes, but also to improve the shelf life of the lard. To ensure your lard is clean and clear, don't just trust your eyes. Instead, strain it carefully to ensure all impurities, including small bits, are removed. This means using a fine mesh strainer, several layers of cheesecloth, or fine muslin. Make sure your strainer or any cloth you use is perfectly clean to ensure your lard doesn't pick up any off flavors. If you're going to all the trouble to make your own lard, you want something you'll be proud to cook with and eat. So to avoid having all your hard work go to waste, be sure to treat your lard with care after you make it. Like any meat-based product, lard can go bad if not properly protected and stored. A few basic steps will help prevent your lard from going rancid, according to information posted by the American Meat Science Association. First, ensure all impurities are removed from the lard before it's stored. Second, cool your lard as quickly as possible after it's rendered. Once the lard is cool, transfer it to small containers for storage. To minimize air exposure, fill storage containers completely and seal them tightly. Store the containers in a cool, dark space. Light and heat will degrade the quality of your lard, according to Soulful Prepper. Filtered lard will keep in the fridge for about a year or in the freezer for about 2 years.